So you mentioned TV, which I'm so glad that you did.
Yeah.
Because my oldest is in his 3s still, and the class that he's in, I think the youngest is 3 and then the oldest is 5 in a couple months.
Mhm.
It's like a really big conversation that the parents are having with the teachers is, well, what do we do with technology and what do we do with screens? And it is the mass belief that it is just wrong, period. Tech is bad, period. And I feel like an outlier when I'm going to these meetings because I feel like I read a lot of the studies, and Peter Attia actually did a really great dissection of all of the current ones when it comes to screens and language development, cognitive abilities, and he was like, "Well, as my interpretation of these studies, this is what the conclusion is." And his conclusion from those studies was there are so many competing factors as to what creates a delay in language or cognitive ability or attention deficit or things that kind of mimic that. It has to do with, like, are you engaged with the content? What kind of content? What other activities are you doing outside of TV? Are you using the TV as a nanny and just putting them in front of the TV for 3 hours, 4 hours a day and just, like, not really parenting? All of these things kind of contribute into all of these concerns that we have as a parent. It's not the
Yeah.
TV. The TV just kind of signals maybe other bad practices as parents that we might have. But rather than look at it that way, they just say, "No, all tech is bad." So I guess what's your stance on technology? And then do we kind of have to supplement it if we are subscribing to a program like Montessori?
Where to start? So, in the Montessori world is you will often find people who are very technology shy, if not outright anti-technology. That's not me, and that's not us, so this is it's not a uniform view, and I don't think it would have been Maria Montessori's view. I think Montessori, there's evidence that she was, like, experimenting with moving images in the classroom and the kinds of like, she was like, "What? You can get a video of an elephant for a child to see instead of just, like, an illustrated picture of an elephant? That's great." But, putting all that aside, just what's the actual right answer here? I think I mean, I would go even further than you went. I would say technology is good. And I don't want my children, so my daughter is 3. She's old enough to kind of absorb vibes from kind of adults about these things. I don't want my children to grow up with adults who are cynical about it,
Mhm.
who are like, "Oh, like screen time sucks," or "social media is destroying the world," or whatever. Like if the like, oh, like yeah, you can watch TV, but that's a bad thing for you to do. And they're kind of like now they're getting these kind of mixed motives and mixed messages. I think the internet is good, technology is good, computers are good, TV is good. That doesn't mean that it's risk free.
Mhm.
Like there are risks to technologies. I mean, and then one of the major risks, like the risk of riding a bike, is that you fall off and crack your skull open. The risk of watching TV is that you turn into a passive zombie and like you're just kind of using the screen as a babysitter and you're watching low value content. You got to manage those risks. Like nothing is risk free, but basically it's good. And yeah, like it shouldn't dominate, like you shouldn't have the child in front of the screens passively all the time to the point where they're not doing other things or interacting with people. That's really bad. But I agree with like who's the author of the study that you mentioned?
He's not the author of the study, but
Oh,
he did like a mass interpretation for
I
his
see.
newsletter is Dr. Peter Attia.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that I don't even think that screen time should be a concept. Like it's like screen time, like calling grandma and like binging on TikTok are not the same category of thing. Like like
Right.
it's not like, oh, there's screen time and both of those things belong together because they share some essential property of being on a screen. There's nothing in common. And I don't even think that I mean my 3-year-old loves movies and she loves narrative. She's like a musical theater kid and she has been since she was 1. We show her Disney movies, like long movies that it's hard for a kid to pay attention to, and she doesn't really fully understand it, and she has to struggle, and she has to ask a million questions. Like that's good for her, and she's very actively engaged, and we'll keep kind of ramping it up the older that she gets. She watches like 30 minutes an hour of TV every day, and I think it's a positive good for her.
Yeah, I'm in the same camp too, and we found, a couple really good shows that have helped with him, like, understanding emotional intelligence and things like mindfulness and breathing. One of our favorites is Stillwater. I don't know if you have her watching that,
I
but
don't know that one.
it is amazing. It's a lot of, like, Eastern philosophy, so, like, there's, like, a lot of Zen and
Oh, the
mindfulness.
books. I know the books.
Okay, yeah, it's
The
on
pan that
Apple.
that panda.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's great. So that's one of our favorites. So if he's in a place we kind of like and I think an important thing too is how many adults aren't really great at modulating like the exact dosage that we should be having of
Yeah.
social media, for example, because it was introduced to us at a weird age and we didn't really know necessarily the how it can hijack your brain. So I think something that's really important for him is to understand how to calibrate that. So when is too much? Like, when are my eyes glazing over? When do I start to feel, like, really fidgety because 'cause I've been sitting for too long? So having him, like, work through those, like, very real things, and then if he gets to this place where he's agitated, be like, "Well, how does your like, what is your body telling you? Like, is your body telling you that maybe you did too much of your iPad or that you
Yep.
did too" right? So not just, like, making the decisions for him, which I think goes back to Montessori, which is
Yep.
self-sufficiency and really instilling a sense of agency into the child.
I think that that's totally true. I have not been as successful with my daughter at getting her to kind of decide to stop. She will decide to stop on her own, but often we impose limits. We're like, yeah, like go outside, do something else. But
Mhm.
I've seen parents who do it. I've seen parents who like have a 2-year-old who like they're like, yeah, we just let them play with the iPad whenever they want, and they just don't use it more than 30 minutes a day. And I'm
Mhm.
like, wow, like I mean, if that's the temperament of your child or that's what you've succeeded in doing in terms of setting up, that's amazing. And I've talked to older children, like 8, 10, 12 year olds who are they're very once the child gets a little bit older, it's not that hard to sensitize them to this kind of thing that you're talking about, and they can be very sophisticated. Like even things like, oh, like a 10-year-old boy or a 12-year-old boy who watches Dune and who also spends a lot of time on TikTok. And the next day they're like, I was thinking about Dune last night as I was falling asleep, and like I have these questions and because Dune is this long, complex, epic story with this rich, and they're like, oh, that's interesting. Like I have a question, like so you can answer the question about Dune, but I have a question like, do you ever think about TikToks the next day? And I'm like, oh, not really. Like I usually just kind of think about them all and then I forget about them. Oh, that's interesting. Like that's an interesting thing to notice. So if you want something that like really stimulates your thought, you might want to watch something longer form or more complicated. Like children can be sensitized to these things. It's just like you said, it's like we haven't figured out as a society, as parents, as educators, like what is the kind of dosage, what is the language around it, how do we teach this skill to make it so that social media it's a terrible servant, or it's a terrible master but an awesome servant. So like how do we,
Mhm.
for some people it's a servant and it's great, and like how do we kind of make our children see it that way?
Mhm. Yeah, I was watching Matthew McConaughey just did a morning interview, and he was talking about the decision that he made for his child to get onto Instagram, and I think his kid's, like, 13 or 14. He's in the teenage era, and I mean, he obviously held out a lot longer than a lot of parents, but the way that he described it is I guess he was, like, showing different examples of how people use it, and it's like, "Well, what are your intentions with this technology?" And I think that's a lot of it is understanding how to use it. Like, you can use it to create, like, just, like, more dispersed and decentralized information, right? Like now you see independent journalism taking off, which is incredible. You see people starting their own schools, which you would have never thought is possible or uh, as popular as it is now. So it kind of gives power back to the individual if you use it properly, or you could just use it as some way to numb yourself. So like teaching your kid intention, I think is also really, really, really important.
I think it's really, really important, and I also think, let's just assume that the world stays the same.
Hmm.
Like it's really important to teach this kind of high agency approach to technology. Like some people are going to be like me, like I'm like on Twitter all the time. I don't think that I'm addicted. I wouldn't describe myself as addicted to Twitter. I think it's a tremendous value for me. But some people might just decide to not use social media that much. Like they like use it a little bit or use it not at all. That's also fine. Like how does it fit into your life? But putting all that aside, I think that social media just has to get better. Like it's actually like, I mean, the first time that like a 14-year-old goes viral or whatever, and they get their phone blows up or their computer blows up and they're getting 6 likes a second, and like it is very hard to kind of contextualize that and process that and kind of, like is, and I generally think that social media, like it's kind of tuned for virality and it's tuned for kind of passivity and repeated things, and it doesn't have to be like the products could be better.
Mhm. No, for sure, but then it's like, how do you get someone to stay on it for as long as possible if
Right.
you're not creating an extrinsic motivating factor? Like, if you're not doing, "Oh, how many followers do I have?" or likes or reposts or comments and yada yada, instead of just having that more internal locus of control where it's like "No, I'm doing this because it's, like, art for me, or it's meaning for me, or it's my
Yeah,
work," or whatever.
exactly, and I think it's like the people that are really good at social media often, who I think have the right perspective on it, they're often either they're light users of it, they kind of use it casually, or they were doing their own weird thing for like 8 years on YouTube and Instagram and Twitter, and nobody cared. They had like 100 followers and like 1 notification a week. And then like after a while, like something clicked and they grew, but like, they like it wasn't like they didn't get it too early. They didn't get the kind of like viral adjustment too early. And so they really centered themselves on like, no, I'm just producing the kinds of things that I want. And now my numbers are going up. And if you're motivated in the right way and numbers are going up, that's great. Numbers go up is not bad. Numbers grow up is good. But if kind of like the first thing that happens to you is like, oh, I can get a lot of attention for being a weirdo or like, you know, acting a little bit slutty or like whatever it is, like that it can like affect your behavior. And I think parents and educators have to be aware of that. Like that, I think the concerns are very real. I just the apocalyptic like social media is bad. It's like heroin. It's like that is not real.
Mhm.
And it's tough as a parent. I sympathize with anybody. I, I, be easy on yourself as a parent if you feel like this is hard or you're making mistakes or you're coming down too hard or you're being too lax. Like everybody's trying to figure this out.